All right, so I am just going to be giving a really brief overview of the concept of ecological drought, or how drought is manifesting in ecosystems. It's going to be a pretty simple overview, and Shelley is going to get into some of the more detailed ways of how we actually measure and quantify ecological impacts of drought. So I'll just start by saying that I think, as Imtiaz has already introduced, drought is a really complex phenomenon. It can be measured in a number of different ways, and it has a wide variety of impacts to humans and to natural environments. So the idea of drought is often broken up into some different components depending on kind of the impact of interest. And we typically think of drought as beginning with a dry atmosphere or with meteorological drought. That can be caused by hotter temperatures or decreased precipitation. And then that can propagate into something like an agricultural drought, which is defined by low soil moisture, lower crop yields. It can translate into hydrologic drought, which would be lower water levels in streams, lakes, reservoirs, and groundwater. It can translate into socioeconomic impacts, impacts to our economies or our social systems. And despite the fact that drought has shaped ecological systems for millennia, until recently, ecological drought was not really part of this lexicon. And so in order to formalize our concept of how drought alters ecosystems in ways that are distinct from hydrologic, agricultural, or socioeconomic droughts, in 2017, our workshop co-host Shelley Crosby and others proposed a definition of ecological drought as an episodic deficit in water availability that drives ecosystems beyond thresholds of vulnerability, impacts ecosystem services, and triggers feedbacks in natural and/or human systems. So just to break down that definition a little further, one component of ecological drought is an episodic deficit in ecologically available water, or the amount of water available for organisms. And that episodic deficit is part of what defines an ecological drought versus an arid system. So a deficit in water availability can be driven by meteorological drought, like reduced precipitation. Anthropogenic climate change can also lower ecologically available water through factors like hotter temperatures, which increase evapotranspiration rates. And of course, we know that climate change can itself drive differences in how meteorological drought manifests. And ecologically available water is also driven by landscape characteristics. So things like soil or topography modify where water is on the landscape. And how we manage our landscapes, including their water, also impacts the availability of ecologically available water on spatial and temporal scales. So by this definition alone, human water use could drive a deficit in water availability, and not all losses of ecologically available water are tied directly to climate. An ecological drought is one that translates into ecological impacts. So organisms are capable of withstanding short periods of water deficit. But when we talk about an ecological drought, we're talking about one that pushes systems beyond their capacity to resist impacts. So a system's sensitivity to a water deficit is driven by ecological characteristics. These are things like life history traits, physiology, population structure, and those impact what species or ecosystems are more or less resistant to water deficit. And the way that we manage systems affects sensitivity. So as one example, we know that forest stands with really high densities tend to have high mortality during drought. So practices like thinning or burning are known to really impact drought sensitivity. And then finally, ecological drought has effects on natural ecological communities, as well as the systems and the services that we value. And this can create important feedbacks. So ecological drought might change the way that we use water or the way that we manage land, and it may change the future sensitivities of systems. So we want to emphasize that ecological droughts impact and are impacted by human activity. Many of us are probably interested in exactly what those ecological impacts are and how we might be able to predict or prevent or measure them. And I just want to reiterate that those ecological impacts are influenced not just by the drought itself, but drought in the context of a changing climate, as well as landscape characteristics, land and water management, and ecological characteristics that are both natural to a system or that we have modified. And Shelley will talk a lot more about how we break down our understanding of these different components. So I'll touch really briefly on how drought actually translates into ecological impacts, starting from a really small scale or what might be experienced by a single plant individual. So starting off with hot and dry conditions, water is being lost from the soil at pretty high rates due to evaporation from the soil and transpiration or plant metabolism. And as drought continues and moisture gets limited, many plants will close their stomates, and that limits water loss, but it also limits photosynthesis. So they're limiting their energy uptake and their water loss at the same time. And so what that means is that after a prolonged drought, plants likely have depleted energy stores because they haven't been doing photosynthesis. And if drought is severe enough, they might actually undergo a phenomenon known as hydraulic failure, which is caused by damage to the plant tissue. And that can prevent water uptake. And at this point, they may not be able to resume functioning even when moisture returns. So you can have some really long-lasting physiological impacts to plants. So this is just reiterating Imtiaz's point about supply and demand both being really relevant for physiological processes. So you can have drought manifest as reduced water supply or as higher water demand. And this is one reason why hotter climates, which are increasing water demand, are exacerbating drought in terms of plant physiology. So that drought stress on an individual plant can result in fitness effects. They can range from reduced growth and reproduction to, at the most drastic, mortality. And in addition to direct physiological effects, drought can also increase the likelihood of other stressors, many of which are acting at really large landscape scales. Probably most obvious to those of us living in the West, drought can promote the severity and the extent of fire through drying of fuels. Drought can also promote disease outbreaks and change disease transmission. So for instance, bark beetle outbreaks are linked to drought conditions, in part because plants with depleted energy stores are less able to defend themselves against pathogens. And then finally, some invasive species are promoted by drought. Depends on the traits of that invader. But for one example is that opening in tree canopies that are caused by tree mortality can facilitate invasions of understory plants like cheatgrass. And a lot of the invasive plants in the north central region, like cheatgrass, are drought tolerant, which means that they may be less impacted by droughts than native plants. We also know that invasive species can alter native species sensitivities to drought through competition or by changing the soil water profile. So there's some potential for feedbacks to develop. We know quite a bit about the physiological impacts of drought on plants, but I also want to highlight some of the ways that drought affects animal species, particularly those in the north central region. So first, the impacts of drought on plants can cascade to animal species through effects on habitat. So for example, opening of tree canopies can alter shade availability. You can also get changes in plant composition that impact animal species. And drought can also just alter the physical or the chemical properties of habitat, especially aquatic habitats. So reductions in stream flow can reduce dissolved oxygen and cause fish kills. Snow drought is another one that represents a form of habitat loss that's relevant to a lot of the species living in the alpine in the north central region. Drought can cause losses of food resources by changing fruit or seed production or reducing productivity of plants like grasses. And these can obviously have cascading impacts on higher trophic levels. Plants animals just like plants can respond physiologically to drought that can manifest as heat and water stress. Drought is also associated with behavioral shifts in behaviors like migration, breeding, or foraging behavior. And then, as with in plants, drought can change the transmission of pathogens or the prevalence of disease. And again, that really depends on the disease. Some may be reduced by drought conditions, while others, for example, toxic algal blooms, may be increased by drought conditions. And then finally, all of these mechanisms can ultimately lead to mortality or reproductive failure, which translate into population level impacts. So I'll end by saying that we know from decades of observation and experimentation that a lot of systems are resistant to drought. So they may just not show a strong ecological response to drought. Many systems are adapted to dealing with water shortages. And others may show some kind of ecological response, but quickly recover. They may be resilient. But there's accumulating evidence that some systems are not able to recover from drought, and that this seems to be becoming more likely in the 21st century. And that could be because droughts are becoming more extreme or long lasting, or it could be that drought is happening in the context of a changing climate or a changing disturbance regime. So in these systems, we have the risk of transformation where systems don't recover from drought, but they transition into a new ecological state. So as an example, in California, the combination of drought and fire is changing chaparral habitat into systems that are dominated by invasive annual grasses. So in the background of this picture is kind of the historical condition, which is a mature closed canopy chaparral. And then following the combination of drought and fire, here in the foreground, you have a transition into a grassland system. So these systems could be transitioning into more climate adapted systems. You could get plants or animals being replaced by ones that are adapted to current climate. And in that way, drought might just be speeding up transitions that are inevitable under climate change. In other systems, though, there's a lot of uncertainty about what community composition will look like after transformation. And that makes it really difficult to prepare. So these longer term transformational impacts of drought are the focus of a project that Shelley, Imtiaz, and I are working on. And if you'd like to find out more about transformational ecological drought, we encourage you to reach out. And I will leave it there. And I think maybe we have a couple minutes for questions.
So when there is one question from Bill here, he says he suspects that in general, ecosystems dry out faster than they remoisten, perhaps asymmetric rates. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh man, that seems like a question for Imtiaz. I'm kind of like the physical properties of evaporation.
But in terms of the plant or behavior, do you see that
Well, how would an amphibian respond? Maybe that's a good, like, do amphibians dry out faster than they rehydrate? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
I always can count on you for interesting questions.
But if I'm looking at more physical system like soil layers, the topsoil layers, I would actually argue the opposite, that they moisten faster than they dry out. Again, because the drying out features could be related to plant transpiration or evaporation, other rates and other factors. But a precipitation event can quickly moisten them very quickly.
Yeah, and I would say with plants, like especially when they've undergone this phenomenon of hydraulic failure, they're actually getting, blockage of the tissues that can uptake water. And so remoistening is really hard when that kind of tissue damage has occurred.